I don't think Jolani's rule is going to last very long. There's no reason at all to be optimistic about Trump or his people. Western think tanks like to say that the Israeli regime has the upper hand, but in fact, they don't. They've lost. What we see in Gaza today was happening in Yemen for 7 years. But the difference was that no one supported Yemen.
I wanted to ask you, what are the pros and cons of the hardliners and the reformists, and how do you look at them so that our viewers can understand a little bit more about Iran? Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. If you want to support us, consider being a YouTube member, a Patreon, or just donate small amount in the link given in the description below. In either event, do watch this show, hit a like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi teaches at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
I wanted to have you on primarily because I wanted your reading of what's going on, particularly in Gaza, but we'd also discuss about West Bank later. But walk us through how you are reading the developments with the ceasefire and exchanges of hostages on both sides.
If we look at what Trump has said and statements made by Israeli regime officials, it seems that the ceasefire may not last, and that the Israeli regime, as usual, is not sincere about preserving the ceasefire. We've seen that in Lebanon as well. Right now, the uh, Netanyahu regime has refrained from pulling out of those small areas in southern Lebanon, which they were able to occupy, even though they were supposed to do so within 60 days. And the regime has a long history of violating commitments. After all, it's a regime that carries out genocide, so commitments for it don't mean anything. It has the backing of the United States. It has the backing of NATO and Western uh, countries. So it feels that it can do anything. So at the moment, uh, it's unclear where things are, but I am not particularly optimistic.
I wanted to ask you that there are some people, including platforms that we deeply admire, like Electronic Intifada, um, who are telling us that it's at the ceasefire is at least a moment of small victory for the Palestinians. There are others also on the pro-Palestinian side who say that it's a bit unfair to think about this as a victory given the scale of destruction and genocide that Israel just got away with under the nose of everyone in the world. I was wondering, how do you see at these two narratives?
I do believe that this was a significant victory and that the Israeli regime has been humiliated. After all, we've seen that they've attempted for over 15 months to wipe out the resistance and to wipe out the Palestinian people with no success whatsoever. Um, and I also believe that the genocide or the Holocaust in Gaza is a defeat for the Israeli regime. What has destroyed Israel in the eyes of the world is the fact that it has presented itself as a racist regime that is willing to slaughter a people, a whole nation, women and children. Their leaders have called Palestinians Amalek. Their leaders have said that there are no innocents in Gaza, which includes children. Their leaders have said they're going to, from the very beginning, that they're going to block food, medicine, water, and all necessary goods for survival from getting into Gaza. They've made many genocidal statements uh, openly. That was well documented and presented a long time ago by the South Africans when they put their complaint forward. And their actions have shown that there's a great deal of consistency between their behavior and their statements. So I think that is a major defeat for the regime. It doesn't see it that way because it is a very racist and ethno-supremacist regime. The West may not like to see it that way, but that's because they support racism. But the rest of the world and many ordinary people in the West do see what's really going on. So I consider that to be even a greater defeat for the regime and the ability for it to succeed in the future. I do understand the point that people make that it is the great tragedy of our time that so many innocent people have been slaughtered. But legitimate resistance comes at a price. The reason why there is resistance is because the oppressor, the colonizer, the imperialist is unwilling to allow people to have their rights. That's why we saw so many people get killed, so many people get massacred in revolutions, in liberation movements across Africa, across Asia, in your country, and in the Americas. It's inevitable. It is not something to be celebrated. It's something extraordinarily tragic, but I think you can celebrate the defeat of the oppressor, even though if it's not the ultimate defeat, but it is a defeat, in my opinion. It is a major defeat for the oppressor, in my opinion. You can celebrate that, but also mourn the the tragedy that has been brought about by its crimes.
I want to follow up on the role of the US, as you mentioned. Donald Trump himself seems very uncertain when he was asked about the sustainability of the ceasefire. His new appointee, the ambassador to the United Nations, excuse me, Elise Stefanik, recently reiterated on camera that she believes in Israel's right to the biblical dominion. Um, and a lot of analysts in the Middle East are saying that the regard for the ceasefire, and if at all that is followed by a reconstruction of Gaza through international aid, is contingent on the US administration's determination to push for peace in the region. What are your thoughts about the new administration in the United States as far as its policy in Palestine is concerned?
I don't think there's any reason to be optimistic. The United States is deeply influenced by Zionism, and the Zionists in the United States are a very powerful force. Uh, Zionists in the United States and in Palestine have a similar ideology, but the bulk of the Zionists are the powerful Zionists are in the United States. So their source of power comes from that country, and they, as we all know, have enormous influence over presidents, senators, congressmen and women, and people, and all decision makers in that country, and of course in Europe as well. So there's no reason at all to be optimistic about Trump or his people. After all, his son-in-law is a Zionist. He spoke about Gaza as if that land does not belong to the Palestinian people in the past, and Trump has made some very somewhat similar remarks recently as well about the future of Gaza. So we shouldn't be naive, and I don't think most people are naive. What Trump did I think, though, was significant that he pushed for a ceasefire. He needed a ceasefire before the inauguration. And I think it just shows how bad this is for the United States and how bad this is for U.S. hegemony. It shows that Trump does recognize that both inside the United States, public opinion has turned against the Israeli regime. Uh, even we should remember that even some of Trump's own supporters, staunch supporters, have turned against Israel. Uh, Tucker Carlson, for example, in his show, has spoken to uh, people who are deeply hostile towards Netanyahu and the regime. He is a very influential person. Candace Owens has turned completely against the Israeli regime, and that I think reflects something bigger, or at least among Trump supporters. And of course, on the other side, the leftists, progressives, and many people who voted for or traditionally voted for the Democratic Party, they too have turned deeply against the Israeli regime. And as we all know, global public opinion is deeply hostile towards the regime as well. So it shows that the reality on the ground has impact, and I think Trump needed that ceasefire to for because he recognized the sea change in public opinion. But that does not mean that he is going to move to stop the genocidal behavior of the regime in the long term, let alone to punish anyone for carrying out the greatest crimes that we've seen in the 21st century, alongside, of course, the genocide in Yemen, which is often forgotten. The genocide in Yemen was supported by the United States, by the Europeans, by the Canadians, and it lasted for 7 years. And the people of Yemen survived that, and they became the most effective, or at least one of the two or three most effective forces in in hurting the Israeli regime during its genocide in Gaza.
I will come back to Yemen in a moment, but talking about not punishing the Zionist crimes, we are having very concrete reports from the West Bank. Jenin, which has been a traditional bastion of resistance since the time of the Second Intifada from the early 2000s, has been bombed by Israel, killing tens of people. But there are also others, areas and towns near Nablus, Bethlehem, Ramallah that have been constantly raided. And what Al Jazeera is telling us is that people are now considering this as, of course, Trump has lifted sanctions on settlers. These are places in the Palestinian occupied West Bank's countryside. And what Al Jazeera is telling us is that people are seeing the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis as doing joint operations against the resistance. I wonder what your thoughts are on the PA in the occupied West Bank.
Well, unfortunately, the PA, as in colonial times, uh, has been the enforcer for the colonizer. We always saw that in all colonies throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout Southeast Asia or Latin America, that the the hegemon, the colonizer, the imperialists, they used local people uh, to enforce their domination. Whether you call it the house slave or the brown sahib or the comprador class or the West truck, uh, it doesn't really matter. Actually, these different names, or the Orientalized Oriental, these different names show, or these different terms show that across the world you have different terms for the same phenomenon. And that is basically that you will have these local people who have a vested interest in working or in collaborating with the hegemon. And the Palestine in the West Bank, it's the same thing. In fact, in Gaza, we also saw how during this 15, 16, over 15 months of genocide, the Israeli regime was cultivating gangs and groups in Gaza to attack convoys, to steal the food, so that it would not be distributed among ordinary people. So they would allow very limited fuel to get into Gaza, and then the gangs that are or in groups that are working with the Israeli regime and in effect being collaborators, they would attack those convoys and uh, set them on fire or steal them, and thus intensify starvation in Gaza. So even in Gaza, we saw that sort of thing. The difference, though, between the West Bank and Gaza is that in general, Gaza was controlled by Hamas and its allies. Islamic Jihad allowed Hamas to have full authority, and so they were able to control these gangs. In the West Bank, the Israeli regime has created this and look at its bidding. So that's nothing new. This has been happening for a very long time. But what it does do in the West Bank, what the Israelis are doing today is being seen differently across the world than before. Because after the genocide in Gaza, people across in the West Bank. And I think the fact that Trump removed those sanctions, token sanctions, they weren't important sanctions. It is symbolic though that it shows that he is going to behave just like Biden, in that he will support the Israeli regime no matter what it does, as long as he can get away with it. The problem is that the world has changed. The West has changed. The world has changed. The balance of power in the region and the world has changed. The West likes to say, because they support apartheid and racism and genocide in Palestine, Western media, Western think tanks like to say that the Israeli regime has the upper hand, but in fact they don't. They've lost. They've lost the war for public opinion. They've lost on the border with Lebanon. They failed. They've achieved. They haven't. They were supposed to go all the way to the Litani River. Uh, they got nowhere near there. In Gaza, they were supposed to wipe out the resistance. It didn't happen. The only place where they did have success was in Netanyahu's alliance with Erdogan and Biden to overthrow the Syrian government. But even there, I think that these three, well, Biden's, we don't know if he's really alive, but I think Erdogan and Netanyahu may regret what they did in Syria, because it seems like it is becoming a huge problem for them, and it could indeed cause instability in countries that are actually in the American camp, because these extremists have become very ambitious. So uh, the Israelis have failed, and uh, the Americans they do not have the power that they did before. Things in Ukraine are not going all that well either. Trump was he was supposed to end the war in Ukraine on day one, and so far it's been almost a week now, and there's no cease last. The weaker the Western camp becomes. It is. We all know how devastating the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was for Western economies and for American power. The war in Ukraine has been much worse. The direct and more importantly, the indirect costs of the war for the West, for the collective West, have been huge. The sanctions on Russia have devastated European economies. And while the Americans have benefited from this devastation, but on the whole, the Americans have lost a lot because no power wants to have broken and weak allies, which become more of a burden than collaborators. So the fortunes of the West continue to decline, and the situation in the West Bank may deteriorate, but there's a huge Palestinian population there, and Gaza has not been subdued, it has not been defeated. And then there's Lebanon. So things may get much worse, but but I don't see any chance for the Israeli regime to success, a road to success for the Israeli regime, whether it's in the West Bank or Gaza or Lebanon.
I want to follow up on what you said that the fortunes of the West are on decline in the region, and I think that's very interesting. Given on one hand, it is in decline and they are in desperation in for reasons that you stated. On the other hand, they also seem to be increasing their rates. For one thing, there is Syria, which we will come back to, and I want to take your update because last time you spoke about Syria on our show, the government fell an hour after you spoke with us. So I want to take an update there. But let's talk about Lebanon. And I was following the news, and President Joseph Aoun, the military leader, has been elected in the recently held election as the president, who is in all regards a Western ally. And Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, I think, has been uncovering a massive embassy complex in Lebanon that can host up to 5,000 personnel. That's like arguably one of the largest embassies after Iraq, which was under occupation. So what seems to me is that in Lebanon, it's not clear whether the footprint of the West is on decline there. So if you could elaborate more on that.
Well, in Lebanon, the president is elected by parliament, and parliament has different factions, and the resistance faction is one faction. And Lebanon has traditionally been deeply influenced by the West, as well as oil and gas-rich regimes in the Persian Gulf. And so there's always been major tensions in Lebanon due to the fact that these forces are allied to the West and to countries in the Persian Gulf, which are allies of the West. And therefore, the West, obviously being supportive of the Zionist regime, is going to always try to make sure that the political elites in Lebanon are not against the regime. And this is nothing new. Uh, the resistance right now is rebuilding itself. After all, they've taken hits, just as the Israeli regime has taken hits, and they are trying to rebuild themselves, prepare themselves for the future, and also help the ordinary people who've suffered. Because, like in Gaza, the Israelis carried out genocidal attacks in Lebanon. Uh, they they bombed towns and cities and apartment blocks to wipe out ordinary people to put pressure on the resistance. These, of course, are crimes against humanity, but Western media was completely indifferent to it. And in fact, Western journalists who are based in Lebanon, they're fixers, they're cameramen, they're uh, their staff, or many of them lived in those neighborhoods. They knew quite well that the Israeli regime was targeting ordinary families out of hatred and spite and racism. But they would continue to say on their live programs or in their reports that the Israelis were bombing Hezbollah strongholds or Hezbollah centers or and use that sort of terminology to justify genocide. Just like in Gaza, these journalists are basically employees of major media networks that are controlled by these very powerful Zionist or pro-Zionist entities. So Hezbollah right now is busy preparing itself for the next stage. But what we see today in Lebanon is something that we've always seen uh, the uh, the country experience, but I don't see that it affects the ability of the resistance to defend itself. The fall of Syria, I think, was definitely a setback for the region because Al-Qaeda is never good news. We have to remember that those people who took Damascus are ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the remnants of these groups. And Hezbollah and the resistance tried to prevent that, along with the Russians and others. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not good news for anyone. They're not good news for the region. They're not good news for Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Jordan or Egypt or Russia or Central Asia or India or China or any country. They are good news for the West because they're used by the West to create instability. We haven't seen over the years many major ISIS attacks or Al-Qaeda attacks in the West, but we've seen major outrages in Iran or in Russia or against interests of countries that have problems with the West. So, like China. So, it is not good news, but we do know that over the past few years, Syria was not helping the resistance anymore after President Assad tilted towards Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, his cooperation with the resistance decreased dramatically. So during the war, when between the resistance regime, Syria really did to help the resistance. The only thing that the Syrian government did was it allowed hundreds of thousands of Lebanese to go to Syria as refugees.
Yeah, I still want to ask you though, whether the fall of Assad government in Syria, uh, whether you would consider it to be a blow to the axis of resistance. And my specific question to you here is, I read an article in the Financial Times which quoted top Iranian officials. Now, we don't know whether they just made it up or whether it's real, but they did cite some sources, their sources, and they said that the Iranian officials said that we didn't like the fact that Assad was causing up with the Qataris and the UAEs because he needed their money to rebuild his economy. I mean, we must acknowledge that the sanctions from 2018 onwards, very harsh sanctions, have crippled Syria's economy, and that's what the report is. I hosted Gevork Almasian recently. He's a Syrian, and I posed this question, and he said that the Iranians should not blame the Syrians for this, given the Iranians themselves are trying to normalize with Saudi. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And what would Assad do, given his situation was so difficult? I want your response to that coverage.
Whenever you see a Western media outlet, mainstream Western media outlet, say unnamed Iranian officials, uh, assume that it's a lie, that they just fabricated it. That should be the assumption from the very beginning. Reuters especially does that a lot, but so does the New York Times and others. Whenever they say an unnamed Iranian official said this, you can be pretty sure that they're not telling the truth. No, I don't think that that was ever the problem for Iran. The problem was that it yeah, the the tilt towards Saudi Arabia and the Emirates came at the expense of the relationship with Iran. It did not uh, add to the list of countries that Syria had better relations with. They decreased their relationship with Iran and increased their relationship with these two countries. So that obviously was not a true statement. Uh, but it came at a big cost for Syria because the Syrians expelled most of the forces that the Iranians had sent to help them against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And when the attack came and the Syrian armed forces were collapsing, basically because of well over a decade of sanctions and occupation, and the Americans were stealing all the oil, and they continued to steal all the oil and the wheat and the grain from the farmlands in eastern Syria, where most of Syria's agricultural products are come from. All of these are being stolen by the Americans. Crushing sanctions, dirty war, all of these uh, made the economy much weaker. Syria last year in 2024, the size of the economy was 15% of the size of the economy in 2010. So 15% of the economy, it just collapsed. And so soldiers were impoverished. Everyone was impoverished. And that is why it fell, because the country was broken. But there were very few people to help the people of Syria. The Saudis and the Emiratis didn't do anything. They didn't help rebuild the country. And so what happened was that the Syrian government uh, lost the ability to defend itself, but it didn't gain anything in return, or its ability to weaken it to defend itself weakened. However, when Syria was collapsing, Iran was prepared to support Syria. But it was very difficult because Iran had to mobilize forces and send them all the way to Syria. And the collapse was very rapid. And there were other complications as well. So Iran didn't want to see Syria collapse. Iran does not want to see uh, people slaughtered by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But let me put it this way. The fall of Syria was a tactical victory for Netanyahu and the Netanyahu-Erdogan alliance because they are allies. We have to remember that over the past 15, 16 months, Erdogan has been sending oil to fuel the genocide in Gaza. The oil comes from Baku, and it's cheap oil. And some of Syrian oil also goes through Turkey to Haifa, the port in occupied Palestine. So they've always had an alliance, despite the rhetoric coming from Ankara. Erdogan has done a great deal to help the Israeli regime carry out the genocide. And it's clear that what happened in Syria was in full coordination. Uh, there was full coordination between Biden, Netanyahu, and Erdogan. Each of them got a piece of the cake, although I don't think that it's going to go well for any of them. But so it was a tactical defeat. But I think in the long run, it is actually a defeat for those who set out to destroy Syria and occupy the country, meaning Erdogan, Netanyahu, and the United States, because Syria is broken and now they own it. And they are the ones who are going to have to pay. And the country cannot be fixed with a few $1 billion. Also, uh, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda and its allies are not going to be able to get the support of the people of Syria. We already see that there's heavy fighting in the east with the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces. We see that in the south, the Druze, they are not prepared to allow this Al-Qaeda or Jolani government to expand their influence in territories that they control. And in the rest of the country, there is chaos. And to be very blunt, Iran has been vindicated because we are seeing every day new footage of atrocities being carried out by these terror groups. And during the previous decade, Iran was constantly attacked for allegedly supporting a dictator. Now, the Iranians were never fans of the Syrian government. After all, it was ruled by the Ba'athist Party, and another faction of the Ba'athist Party invaded Iran in the 1980s. Of course, the two factions are were always at odds with each other, but in any case, it's not exactly a party that Iran loves. But Iran always said that whatever whatever the Ba'athist government is, whatever President Assad's government is, it is better than Al Qaeda and ISIS. And I think much of the world agrees with that. Only in the West was it otherwise, and Arab regimes that were supporting the dirty war through Al Jazeera and other networks, they were propagating Al Qaeda. And so many people in the region fell into the trap of sectarianism or racial hatred or religious hatred. And all of these tools were used in order to demonize Iran and to demonize the Syrian government. But I think now it's becoming increasingly clear when the so-called foreign minister of Al Qaeda has has uh, has such a friendly meet, a meeting with the former British Prime Minister who actually carried out the war in Iraq. I think those people who are sane and normal and who are not sectarian or biased see the reality of what happened in Syria. So Iran has been vindicated. Every day that goes by, Iran is increasingly vindicated. And those pretenders who said that they supported Palestine or the people of Syria, I think they've been exposed. So in the long term, what's happening in Syria is not going to go well for those who are now occupying it, in my opinion. And I think they also the culture of this extremist organization can expand into Turkey itself. It can expand into countries in the region, which are all in the American camp. Jordan feels threatened. Egypt feels threatened. Saudi Arabia feels threatened. And this is not necessarily good news for the United States. So I don't think Jolani's rule is going to last very long. I don't know when it will come to an end. But I think that Mr. Erdogan, from Mr. Erdogan, from what I'm hearing from friends who are in, in his party uh, and others in Turkey, he is already regretting, or the people around him are already regretting uh, what's happened. In fact, the expectation was not to take, they didn't expect to take Syria. When Al Qaeda attacked, well, they were hoping to reach West Aleppo so that Mr. Erdogan could have a stronger hand at the negotiating table with the Syrians and to put pressure on the Syrians to actually negotiate with them. But everything fell apart, and which was unexpected for all of us. Uh, and so now they have to pay for the whole country, and the country is in ruins.
What would be Iran's relationship with the HTS? Would it have a diplomatic relationship or there would be no relationship?
No, Iran definitely will not have a good relationship with HTS. HTS is a terror organization. It is Al Qaeda. When HTS separated from Al Qaeda, it did so with the consent of Al Qaeda because it was just a PR move. I actually tweeted the ceremony where they separated. It was like a husband and wife who loved each other. They separated because they wanted other, they out of necessity, now not out of dislike. And both were saying, yes, I support the other side. So uh, if someone looks this up on my Twitter account, they can see it. During the when HS separated from Al Qaeda, Jolani praised Al Qaeda and he praised Osama bin Laden and he praised all of his colleagues and who worked with him. So there's no ideological separation. There's no ideological difference between ISIS, Al Qaeda, and HTS. We have to remember that uh, Jolani was the deputy of ISIS. When it was the Islamic State of Iraq, he was the deputy of Abu Bakr Baghdadi. Jolani murdered thousands of people in Iraq in car bombs. So this is not a sane person. This is not a normal human being that Iran can have some sort of meaningful relationship with. And in fact, I think, as I said, what we're now seeing is a vindication of Iran. Iran wants to see Syria strong and stable. But now the burden is not on Iran's shoulders. And the money that Iran spent to prop up Syria uh, is no longer being spent there. So Iran doesn't have to send Syria free food or free gasoline or free oil or free medicine. That was a burden for Iran. And now the burden is on Mr. Erdogan and on Qatar and whoever else is in charge of the country, because obviously Jolani isn't in charge. So they're the ones who are going to have to cough up this money. And the situation today is much worse than what it was back then. So back then it was the Iranians, the Russians, the Iraqis, and the Algerians who were supporting the Algerians to a lesser extent. Their economy was facing more greater difficulty, but who are helping the Syrian people. Now it's not their burden anymore. And Mr. Erdogan and Qatar have to pay for this mess that they've created, and it's going to be very costly. And the situation today in Syria is much worse than it was before.
I have two quick questions. My first question on Iran. I recently watched Farid Zakaria's interview of Javed Zarif, Vice President for Strategic Affairs of the Islamic um, Republic of Iran. I don't know if you have watched it. Fascinating interview, obviously, for its own biased questions on geopolitics of the region. But I want to ask you something about what Vice President Zarif spoke about Iran. I want to understand that from you. He said that there are reformists in Iran and there are hardliners in Iran. And this is something that is often spoken about, but it's also very confusing because hardliners are those that, as we understand, are very firm to the original idea of the Islamic Revolution. They are now called as socially conservative, but they also talk about national reliance and very firm on foreign affairs. The reformists would talk about building better relationship with the West, but Vice President Zarif also spoke about social policies, like saying he said that in the streets of Tehran, you would see women without headscarf, even if it's illegal. The leadership has decided not to impose those. He also mentioned about minorities, governors in Iranian Balochistan and Iranian Kurdistan, and he says that these reformist policies are in the right direction, although they are not enough. So I wanted to ask you, what are the pros and cons of the hardliners and the reformists, and how do you look at them so that our viewers can understand a little bit more about Iran?
I haven't watched the interview, so I can't comment on anything that he said. I think it's important to always keep in mind that Iran is a very complex and dynamic country. And there are no two camps in the country. The reformists themselves, whatever that may mean, are broken and fragmented into many different groups. And the so-called conservatives, or as they call themselves, the principalists, they're broken and fragmented into many different groups. And often you'll see different factions among the different groups working together and not aligning with the factions from this broader group that they supposedly belong to. And of course, most ordinary Iranians are neither reformists nor principalists or conservative. They're independent. And so I think that is something that you should always keep in mind. And public opinion in Iran differs in during different periods of time uh, on different issues. And contrary to what you would understand about Iran, supposedly, from Western media, where this is a dictatorship and it's actually Iran is far more open than the West. Let me give you an example. In the West, does any mainstream media outlet, a single one, stand against the genocide in Gaza? None. They're all pro-genocide. Every single one. You cannot name a single media outlet that is against the Israeli regime. In Iran, Iran, as you know, supported Syria. There are news outlets in Iran that celebrate the fall of Syria because they are liberal and pro-Western. Do they constitute the majority? No, but they are, and they have been, a force of influence in Iran for many years. So in Iran, you can, despite the fact that the policy of the, the government and the state and the Islamic Republic of Iran has been to expand its relationship with the global majority, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Um, its policy has been to support the people of Palestine, people of Lebanon, the people of Yemen. These very same media outlets, they're against these policies, and they support uh, improving relations with the West and having an excellent relationship with the United States at the expense of Iran's relationship with the global majority. These websites, these news outlets, these Telegram channels, which have offices in Tehran, want Iran to move away from its relationship with Russia, to move away with its relationship with China, to move away with its relationship with India, and to prioritize its relationship with Europe and most importantly the United States, and to basically have nothing to do with the Palestinian issue except for verbal support, which basically means nothing. So you have this ongoing debate in Iran. It's not new at all, but it's something that is not acknowledged in the West. And in the West, whenever there's debate in Iran, they present this as internal tensions. But in the West, if there's debate, it's called checks and balances and democracy at play and that sort of thing. So it's not recognized in Iran because Iran is a regime, as they like to call it. But but they don't have regimes in the West. So basically, what I can say for your viewers is that one thing, if one wants to understand Iran, I think Gaza is the best example. Morally speaking, where does Iran stand? It is the country that supported the resistance. It is the country that supported Gaza. It we know that the resistance capabilities in Gaza all come from Iran. The same is true in Lebanon. The same is true in Yemen. Iran supported the Palestinians and those who supported the Palestinians, and the West supported genocide, and the West supported a Holocaust. So when it comes to moral hierarchy, who is higher up in this hierarchy? Iran or these Western countries uh, that are that own the genocide?
My last and final question on the moral hierarchy. You mentioned Yemen as one of the few, actually the Houthis, because Yemen is divided, as the Houthis as one of the progressive forces of resistance, particularly in the case of the Palestinian movement. We have recently seen President Trump redesignating the Houthis as terrorists. It was always the case until President Biden had revoked it for a while following the de-escalation between the Saudis and the Houthis, which was again reimposed after the Houthis started expressing solidarity with the Palestinians. And the statement coming out of the White House recently is that we would use our regional allies to suppress the Houthis. And this sounds like the so-called Arab Spring, which was the Arab winter, where President Saleh fled, and then Hadi came to power, but he couldn't hold up, and the Houthis increasingly gained ground from the north until Sana'a, and the Presidential Council was reduced to control from Aden, which the West recognizes. Do you fear the escalation of that civil war, which has kept Yemen divided for so long?
I think it's pretty clear that it's not really the Houthis. The Houthis are a part of Ansarullah. And Ansarullah has very widespread support across Yemen. Uh, the United States has been bombing Yemen before the Ansarullah has been designated as a terrorist organization again. So over the past few months, and over the past year and a half, the United States has been bombing, yeah, Ansarullah day and night, and they've imposed all sorts of ruthless policies against the people of Yemen in order to weaken Ansarullah. Why? Because Ansarullah was blocking the Red Sea to implement the Genocide Convention. So Ansarullah was blocking the Red Sea to stop the genocide in Gaza, and the Americans and the British were trying to open the Red Sea to ships going to Israeli ports to help the genocide. This is this is again goes back to that moral hierarchy where the United States is at the bottom. It is, it's utterly immoral, and Ansar Allah is highly moral. Despite 7 years of genocide against Yemen and against Ansar Allah, they fought for the people of Gaza. They made huge sacrifices like Hezbollah. Hezbollah and Ansar Allah made the greatest sacrifices. Hezbollah's sacrifices were even greater because they are bordered with the Israeli regime. They they fought to help Gaza, and their women and children were slaughtered as a result. So Ansarullah today, it is the government in Yemen. They've the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, has been under the control of those revolutionary forces that are led by Ansarullah. And the only reason why parts of the south, which is not highly populated, 70, I think around 80% of the population of Yemen lives in areas which are controlled by the Yemeni government and Ansarullah. Those areas which are not controlled, which are mostly desert, and they have much smaller population, it is fund money that is coming in from the Emirates and others to fund these militias and groups that keep the South apart from Ansarullah. It's not because they're popular. And I think Ansarullah today is much more powerful than it was a year and a half ago because Ansarullah, we have to remember, Al Jazeera, Arabic media, all of them demonized Ansarullah for many, many years. We have to remember that when the genocide in Yemen began in 2000 and I think 15, um, Qatar and Saudi Arabia were on the same side. Al Jazeera was justifying the genocidal war. Only later on, when Saudi Arabia and Qatar had a falling out and they became enemies, did Al Jazeera's position and the government of Qatar's position change on Yemen?
This was
So,
also building on
that-
Al Jazeera's positive coverage of the so-called Arab Spring. They were very, very enthusiastic.
that's right. But in the case of Yemen, they were standing against the popular support that Ansarullah had, and they were supporting a genocide and these genocidal attacks. What we see in Gaza today was happening in Yemen for 7 years. But the difference was that no one supported Yemen. All the state media outlets controlled by these oil and gas-rich regimes were all supporting Saudi Arabia. And so many ordinary Arabs were against Ansarullah because they were being fed propaganda, just like in Syria, just like with regards to Hezbollah. But um, but now Ansarullah is a household name across the world. They're heroes. So back just just a couple of years ago, they were demonized, but now people see the reality. People on the streets of Cairo, in people on the streets of capitals across the Arab world and beyond. People know that it's the role that Ansarullah played. So they have a very and in Yemen as well. People see Ansarullah as heroic. So Ansarullah today is much stronger than before. And any country that wants to work against Ansarullah, they have to keep in mind that they're very vulnerable. Ansarullah has survived, and Yemen has survived now effectively a decade of genocide because over the last year and a half, the Americans and the British have been, and the Israeli regime have been bombing it. But they're still steadfast. But so those regimes that would want to contemplate attacking Ansarullah, they have assets that can easily be destroyed by Yemen's drones and missiles. So I think we're living in a different world today than the world that we saw a few years ago. Ansarullah is much stronger today than it was before, and those who were indifferent towards the genocide, those who did not come to the defense of the Palestinian people, their uh, their image has been collectively diminished. The resistance today, in my opinion, is much stronger than what it was a year and a half ago, despite war, despite the slaughter, despite the destruction. Because the American camp and the Israeli camp and those who supported it, whether it's Erdogan or Sisi or Abdullah II in Jordan or Mohammed bin Zayed, their status has been diminished. And the status of those who supported the resistance in Gaza has been enhanced. And we saw that when Abu Ubaidah made his speech after the ceasefire, where he thanked Hezbollah in particular, and Iran, and Ansarullah, and the Iraqi resistance, and also those Jordanian civilian, Jordanian individuals, not the government, that went and into the West Bank to fight. So uh, I think that Yemen today is much stronger than before, and I think that Ansarullah today has much more weight than it had before as well.
Professor Marandi, thank you so much for your time for our viewers to see more, to understand more about the divisions of Yemen between North and South, between the Presidential Leadership Council, the Southern Separatist Movement, and Ansar Allah. Watch our show with Helen Lechner. That was a wonderful show. And to understand Al Jazeera's coverage of the Arab Spring, watch our show with Kevork Almasian. With that, Professor Marandi, thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day ahead.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.